Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 4,000 watt VoltMaster generator. It is powered by an 8-horse Briggs flathead engine and appears to be in really good condition. You know, the date code on the machine is May of 1987, and I would say someone cared for this quite a bit. Anyway, the person listing this on Facebook knew nothing about its run condition. He basically said, come and get it, or it's going to the dump this weekend. So yeah, it was a no-brainer, and I'm willing to bet it will run with a bit of work. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. Well, first things first, let's check the oil. Make sure we have some. And I actually don't see any oil, though there is some down there, but it's pretty low. Let me get you in there real close. So the oil should be filled up right to the last thread, and you can see clearly it's not, but there is some oil in there. And it is hard to tell, but it looks kind of on the newer side. So yeah, I usually don't like changing the oil before the machine's earned it. But in this case, since we're kind of low, I'm thinking, let's just pull the plug, we'll get out whatever's in there, and we'll just start with some fresh. Yeah, it's almost a shame I drained this oil. It looks brand new. The engine's never been fired on it. So that is a very good sign. Someone clearly was taking care of this machine, but it was just a bit low. So now we are topped off. So we should be safe to try to start this when we get to that point. I'm thinking we should check the condition of the airbox. The pictures on Facebook Marketplace showed a ton of acorns around this machine. So I did kind of wash off the outside before we even turned the camera on, but I haven't checked the airbox, the blower housing, and some of the other common areas that you might find a critter. Anyway, it's not a good sign. This wig nut is not spinning off. Let's see if we can get it with some pliers. All right. It is spinning. And now it's stuck again. So let me actually spin that back in. I'm going to use the Dremel, the little wire wheel. We'll just try to clean those threads. And we'll try this again. Yeah. Still tight, but it is coming off. And actually, it looks like we're loose down on the bottom. So as soon as this wing nut comes out, this entire thing's just going to fall out through the bottom of the intake. And yeah, actually looks pretty good in here. That filter looks brand new. Again, potentially the engine's never been fired with this filter, but it is stuck. So that is interesting. There we go. So yeah, things look clean in here. Nothing to be concerned about other than this right here doesn't seem to be secured properly. So let's take a look at that. But I think the airbox is in good shape, so we'll fix that issue and get this closed back up. So this piece right here, it's supposed to be bolted on to the bottom of the carb. That's what holds it in place, that and just the wing nut up above. But that bolt is missing, so this is just kind of free to spin. You know, it's not technically a vacuum leak. You know, the engine will run fine without that bolt plugging the hole. But it's also the support for the governor bracket, and it's just an area where unfiltered air can get in. So we should replace that. Let me look around, see if I have anything of the correct thread. All right, I think I have a winner. It's not an OEM Briggs bolt, but you know what? It'll get the job done, assuming that the threads aren't stripped out here, which I would doubt that they are. Perfect. Well, I think for now, we're going to give the carb the benefit of the doubt. You know, what I've seen so far is that someone cared for this machine. So there is a reasonable chance that the carb may not need any work. But you still want to check the throttle plate. Just make sure it's not stuck. And if you can see the governor linkage, also double check that. Make sure it's connected and moving. So that seems to be okay. Choke also seems to work without issue. We do have potentially a starter recoil issue. The rope is up here, although it looks like it does retract. And the engine, it rotates, and it has compression. So we have compression. Most likely we do have timing. You know, I think the big wild card here is fuel and spark. And I couldn't help notice, but the plug, it is a torch. So I can't say that I've ever noticed one of those in a Briggs of this vintage. This is a Chinese spark plug, and there should be a champion in here, most likely an RJ 17 LM or potentially a 19 LM. So I'm going to look that up. We'll test for spark, and assuming we have it, which we likely do, then we might do the easy thing. We'll add some fuel to the tank and see if this thing fires off. That said, though, we can't just add fuel to the tank because the tank, it is not connected, and these lines are absolutely petrified. So we do, at a minimum, need to run a new fuel line. But before we do that, let's deal with this issue, and then we can move on to the fuel. So I'm sure the torch plug still works. But they're not known for reliability, so I'd rather just pull it. But we will test this plug, I guess, before tossing it in the trash. Anyway, I did double check what plug we can use in its place, and it is an RJ 19 LM. Yeah, it looks brand new. All right, let's check for spark. Keep an eye on the tip. Beautiful. Nice, strong spark. I don't want to give away any personal information here, but it looks like this machine was last serviced February 7th, 2013. So we know 12 years ago at least this was likely running, and potentially that was the last time it ran. So I'm thinking there's a very good chance that this is just going to run without even a carb clean. I took a look in the tank. I was a little concerned because it was bypassed and an external tank was being run. And the tank is actually quite clean. You know, there is a little bit of varnish down there, but I think that is actually going to wash out once I put some fresh fuel in there. But for now, I'm not going to use the tank. You know, I don't want to overload that carb, especially, you know, if the needle's not working. Don't want to flood it. So for now, I'm just going to remove or cut off, you know, what remains of the fuel line there are on both sides. And we'll just run a test line for now. We'll just give it a measured amount of fuel, and we'll try to fire it off of that. Although I am thinking I might add a little fuel to the tank anyway. You know, that way we can test if the valve is working. And assuming it is, you know, that little bit of fuel that's in there will help dissolve that varnish. And after the engine runs, we'll just drain it out and start over with some fresh fuel and some new fuel line. And apparently a new clip too, because this clip just bent. But the clip, like the fuel line, it is original. It has the red paint all over it. There we go. So it looks like the needle is holding nice and steady. So the carb, at least it accepted fuel, and the needle seems to be working. So let's give this a try. I've got a light plugged in and turned on, as well as the kilowatt. So we'll give it a couple pulls. Let's see what we get. gotta love these old Briggs flatheads. It took a good few pulls, but it did finally take off. And it actually ran fast. It was at about 65 hertz. So I backed off the spring tension. We got it closer to 62 hertz, which is still a little bit fast. But I kind of stopped there because I noticed the voltage was also going down quite a bit. I think at that engine speed, we were at about 117 volts, which is a little bit concerning. This does not have an automatic voltage regulator. And if it was brushed, then that voltage would come down another 20 volts under load. But I think this is brushless. And because of that, that run capacitor should maintain the voltage, if not increase it when under load. So I do want to try that real quick before moving on. I actually ran out of fuel, so I kind of had to shut things down. That said, though, we are looking pretty good. I tried fine-tuning the needles, and they were actually pretty good where they were. The other thing worth noting, too, is that when this thing first started, it did start launching some debris, a couple nuts, some leaves. So there was definitely a nest in here, and I think there is still some debris. So we are going to have to pull this blower housing off and just make sure everything is clean. On an air-cooled engine, it's really important that the air can pass properly over the head. And something like a critter nest could certainly cause engine damage if the engine overheats. So that is something we will look into. But for now, I'm thinking let's refuel. We'll start it again. But this time, I'm going to put a 1500 watt load on, and I want to see how the voltage reacts under that kind of a load. All right, we are refueled. So it's going to be pretty much the same setup as last time. The big difference is we now have the space heater. So I'm going to get the engine started. We'll do a quick double check of the voltage and the speed, and then we'll put a 1500 watt load on and see how the voltage reacts. Okay, good. That was a really good test. So without a load, we started out at about 62 hertz, 113 volts, which is low. That's about as low as you can go and still be passable. Once I put a 1500 watt load on, which is about 40% capacity, that voltage came up by 5 volts, closer to 118 volts. So I would say the capacitor is good. It is responding the way that I would expect. So there's not a lot more to do to this machine other than make sure the critter is evicted, and then we'll finish it up by running some new fuel line. So we've got one bolt on each side here on the bottom, a couple on the top, and I think if we're lucky, we can sneak this blower housing out of here without having to remove anything else. Okay, it actually looks pretty good in here. Not really seeing much for debris, so I think we can put the blower housing back on. Before we do that, though, we will add just a little bit of oil right there. Otherwise this can bind up and cause problems. So just some thin oil is all you need. Although I say it looks good in here, I do see a little bit of debris in the fins up above, so we'll just blow it out before we put the housing back on. And it looks like a critter did chew a little bit of insulation off right there. It's not enough to affect it. It seemed to be running all right. But I'm thinking I might just put a few wraps of electrical tape here to help build that back up. And actually, before we move on to the fuel line, I'm just going to double check the torque on the head bolts. What usually happens on these engines is that the bolts over by the exhaust, they tend to stretch a little with repeated heat cycles. So likely the torque is not right, kind of in this corner, but we'll check them all and just make sure that they are all set properly to 200 inch-pounds. So we'll start with the ones over here, which should be torqued properly. Yeah, that one's good. That's good. No issues there. So far, so good. That one might have turned a little. Okay, and the three that are left are the ones that might be a little loose. Yep, it's turning. Not a lot, but it did turn. A little bit on that one. And that one was pretty good. So, yeah, not too bad considering. I think that was the worst. A little bit right there, and the rest were all good. Yeah, it looks like leaving the fuel in there did not dissolve any of that varnish, which is really not a big deal. I think it will break up eventually and just dissolve into the fuel. And it's not going to be an issue for the carburetor. I think if it was chunky, then that might be something to be concerned about. But I am going to add a fuel filter anyway on the new fuel line. All right, let's just check the flow real quick. I'm going to crack the valve open and just make sure everything works as it should. Actually, the valve isn't opening. So yeah, let's go back to the other side and see if we can get that to work. So I think it's been some time since this valve has opened. And I'm afraid I'm going to put too much force on it. So it might be one of those things, now that we have fuel in there, it might kind of work its way in there a bit and allow this to open. But I'm thinking we might need to loosen this nut and clean stuff out. Of course, there is a little fuel in the tank now, so yeah, I think we're going to have to do that. All right, that loosened up pretty easily. Let's see if that made any difference. And it did not. So yeah, we might need to take this valve off and clean it properly before this will free up. Otherwise, we're going to break it, and then we're going to have to find a new one. So I'm going to get this fuel line back off, and I think I can spin this whole thing off. We'll just put something underneath to catch the fuel, and then, likely we'll soak this in the ultrasonic and see if that will free up the pin that goes through the center here. I'm going to let this soak for about 10 minutes and we'll check back on this. So, I did back off this nut right here so we can get some degreaser up behind it as well as all the other directions. So with any luck and a bit of heat, maybe that'll break free. It's moving. Yeah, I think that did it. Although it's still really tight. But if I can get that out, we can clean up that pin. And I think we'll be back in business. Yeah, it was just gummed up with a bunch of varnish. So let me take a little Dremel wire wheel to that. And then I think we need to soak it some more because it is really coated and gummed up. The valve cleaned up pretty well. Unfortunately, I took some of the paint off as well, but that's okay because, if this didn't work, we would have had to buy a new valve anyway, which would have had no paint on it either. So we'll get this nut tightened back up. There is a rubber O-ring, which hopefully still seals. Guess we'll find out in a minute. So I'm going to get this resecured. We'll put some fuel in the tank. We'll test the valve again, and hopefully this time it functions as it should. All right, so far so good. Let's open it up. And yeah, we've got some fuel flow. So I think we're good. Let's connect that fuel line. And I think we'll be ready to go. And we'll do the same test just to flush the line a little bit. So we're just about ready to get this thing started and put it to the test, but there are two things we need to do first. When setting up, I noticed there was actually an acorn down in the fan area for the rotor. So I'm going to try to fish that out if possible. Also, the hookups here are not great. We have a couple 120 out and we have a 240, but the 240 has no neutral, and that is a problem because the load bank, although I have it wired for 240, the loads are actually 120 loads running in parallel. So I need the neutral wire for the load bank to work. So what I did was convert this 6-15 to an L14-30. And I'm going to use the ground as the neutral, and it's on the neutral pin. So theoretically, that'll work, as long as we have a bonded ground to neutral on this machine. So I'm going to test that real quick. And assuming we do, then I think we have the green light to use the load bank on this machine. I'm going to unplug both of these so we don't get any false readings here, but what I want to do is test between the ground and the neutral. Now I've got the multimeter set to test continuity, so if those two are connected, we should get a beep. And we do. So we'll put one lead in the neutral, the other in the ground. And yeah, this is a neutral bonded machine, so I think we're safe to try the load bank out. Well, I think we're about as ready as we're going to get. The tank is full of fuel and everything is wired in to this machine. Now, the generator, it is rated at 4,400 watts, and I would say that might be a stretch given that we only have an 8-horse engine, but I think it can do it as long as the jetting is correct, so we might have to fine-tune that just a bit. Anyway, I'm going to get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the outputs, both the voltage and the hertz, as well as the total harmonic distortion. We'll take a look at the sine wave, and then we'll put on a half load, do the same, and assuming everything goes well, we'll go for the max of 4,400 watts. So no issues at all getting this machine started, but the engine speed was a little fast, so I backed that off. Now we're closer to 61.5 hertz, and it looks like the load bank has power as well, so I think we're good to go. Without a load, we're at 9.6% THD, and the sine wave is a train wreck. But some brushless are quite dirty, like this one. So let's put on a load. I'm going to start easy with 1,000 watts, and we'll see how the jetting reacts. No issues. About 1,500, 2,000. So that is approximately half load. Seems to be handling it just fine, and the THD is at 9.1, and the sine wave cleaned up just a bit. So we'll give this a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max of 4,400 watts. Well, it's been a few minutes, and no issues at all at 2,000 watts. So let's swap these loads for 2,000 plus 500. So now we're at 2,500 watts. Let's try 3,000 watts, 3,500, 4,000. So it's doing it. And under that kind of a load, we're at 11.5% THD. And the sine wave cleaned up a bit. So let's push it a little more, which technically will be an overload, and I'm not sure it's going to be able to do it. So now we're back to 4,000 watts. Let's try 4,500 plus that light, so actually 4,600. Nope, cannot do that. So 4,000 watts with this setup is pretty much the best it's going to do. Okay, no issues. So I'm going to take the load off, and we'll give the load bank and the engine a second to cool down. Well, I'll be the first one to admit these older machines, they're not worth a lot of money. You know, the prior owner gave this away for free, and the pictures of it weren't too promising. It was stored in a shed. It was surrounded by a mountain of nuts, so clearly the machine hadn't been maintained in a while. Yet these old Briggs, they are fairly bulletproof, and it didn't require much of anything to get up and running again. And now it's running quite well. No issues powering a 4,000 watt load. So, you know, I dare say this older machine is probably going to outlast most of the newer ones sold today. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.